The Mexican-American War, 1846 to 1848, was a pivotal conflict brought on by Mexico's instability following its independence from Spain and American expansionism. War broke out as a result of tensions over disputed borders and Texas, which the U.S. annexed in 1845. Motivated by the idea of manifest destiny, the United States began aggressive campaigns and took control of important areas like Mexico City and California. With the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which gave the United States enormous territories in return for $15 million, the war came to an end, changing the map of North America and leaving a legacy of division and expansion. The American-Mexican War Mexico was in complete chaos even though it had gained independence from Spain a few years earlier in 1821, following a revolution and a 10-year-long armed conflict. Mexico, one of the largest nations at the time, appeared larger on the map of that era than it does today. The recently independent country was in terrible shape. Internal conflicts for control of a government resulted from the revolutionaries' failure to establish plans or guidelines following 11 years of war. At the time, Mexico lacked the resources necessary to organize its roughly 4.5 million square kilometer nation. Internal uprisings were a threat to Mexico, as was the possibility of Spanish forces invading from their base in neighboring Cuba. This administration lacked stability and was unprepared for a global conflict. The United States was expanding and much larger than it was when it gained independence when war with the Americans broke out just 20 years later in 1846. The United States of America bought the vast Louisiana territory from the French and pushed farther into Native American lands. Even though the nation was growing, there was room for more. Several areas of Mexico rebelled and attempted to secede as a result of internal issues. In 1836, Texas became independent of Mexico. Because northern political interests opposed the creation of a new slave state, the United States initially refused to admit it to the Union. Since the Mexicans still regarded Texas as part of their territory, the Mexican government was also promoting border raids and threatening to start a war if they attempted to annex the state. However, following Polk's election in 1844, when he ran on a platform of annexing Texas and reoccupying the Oregon Territory, annexation procedures were promptly started. In addition, Polk was interested in New Mexico, California, and the remainder of the present-day southwest region of the United States. Polk made an offer to buy those lands to grow, but the offer was turned down. He quickly sparked hostilities by advancing troops into a disputed area between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande that both nations had previously acknowledged as belonging to the Mexican state of Coahuila. The disputed lands became a source of increasing tension. On December 29, 1845, the United States annexed Texas, making it the 28th state. However, Mexico refused to acknowledge Texas's independence or the United States' offers to buy the territory, so the United States inherited the conflict over the country's southern and western borders. The tensions between the two nations thus escalated into a war as a result of this act. About a dozen American soldiers were killed on April 25, 1846, when Mexican cavalry attacked a group of them in the disputed zone led by General Zachary Taylor. Then, along the Rio Grande, they besieged an American fort. At the battles of Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma, Taylor defeated the Mexicans after calling in reinforcements. After those battles, Polk informed the U.S. Congress that even before Mexico crossed the U.S. border, invaded our country, and poured American blood on American soil, the cup of forbearance had been used up. Although Mexico never made an official declaration of war, Congress did so on May 13th. The question of how the war started is up for debate. We have a poorly prepared Mexico with internal uprisings and a growing power that seeks to increase its influence. The United States didn't want to appear like a bully, even though Mexico was weaker. Nevertheless, in his memoirs, Ulysses S. Grant, a former opponent of the war who was a lieutenant in Taylor's army, asserts that the primary objective of the U.S. Army's advance from the Nueces River to the Rio Grande was to incite war without actually attacking first to weaken any political opposition to the conflict. Following Mexican independence, Antonio López de Santa Anna was a controversial figure who initially opposed Mexican independence from Spain, but later fought in favor of it. After that, he supported the Mexican Empire's monarchy, rose against the emperor, and then favored a republic. As the nation searched for its course, these shocks eventually caused more problems and weakened it. Over 22 years, Santa Anna held 12 non-consecutive terms as president. An internal alliance, which included President Mariano Paredes, who was expelled, pushed for a return to a federal republic with Santa Anna as the head of state after the United States declared war on Mexico in 1846. In a letter to Mexico City, Santa Anna expressed his desire to leave exile in Cuba and use his military background to retake Texas for Mexico, but he did not want to run for president again. Desperate, President Valentin Gómez Farías took the offer and permitted Santa Anna to return. President Farías was unaware that Santa Anna had been secretly negotiating with U.S. representatives to sell the United States all disputed territory at a fair price in exchange for permission to return to Mexico via U.S. naval blockades. After his return to Mexico, Santa Anna assumed command of the army. After assuming this influential role, he broke his promise by appointing himself president and getting ready to repel the invasion by American forces. At Resaca de la Palma and the Battle of Palo Alto, the Americans won 2 battles. General Stephen Watts Kearny and his forces started moving into New Mexico and the disputed area. When the American troops arrived on August 15th, they did not come across any Mexican forces. Without firing a shot, they moved into Santa Fe and seized the New Mexico territory for the United States. On August 18th, Kearny established a civilian government and proclaimed himself the new territory's military governor. The Kearny Code, a provisional legal framework, was established. September 25, 1846, was Kearny's departure date for California. Following the successful conquest of New Mexico, Kearny's Army of the West, under the command of Alexander Doniphan, continued its 5,500-mile campaign into present-day northwest Mexico in December 1846. The Taos Revolt was a rebellion that started in the area. Although there were several skirmishes, the American military put an end to the uprising swiftly. At the same time, John D. Sloat, the commander of the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, had been ordered to blockade the ports of California and take control of San Francisco Bay. In December 1845, Captain John C. Fremont entered the Sacramento Valley as the leader of a U.S. topographical expedition that was surveying the Great Basin. Word of an impending Mexican-American War reached Fremont's party at Upper Klamath Lake in the Oregon Territory. After that, the group headed back to California. Fremont brought 160 volunteers to Monterey at Sloat's request. On July 15th, Sloat handed over command of the Pacific Squadron to Commodore Robert F. Stockton, a more aggressive military leader, in addition to the California Battalion. Following their separate departures, General Castro and Governor Pio Pico fled to the Mexican state of Sonora. On August 13th, Stockton's army marched into Los Angeles without any opposition. Stockton then reported to the Secretary of State that Mexican dominion had completely left California. In the meantime, in late November 1846, U.S. Colonel Stephen W. Kearny had marched across the Sonoran Desert, New Mexico, and the Colorado River. At the Battle of San Pascual on December 7th, Kearny's army of roughly 150 men was opposed by 100 lancers, led by the governor's brother, General Andres Pico. The injured Kearny persisted until he was forced to take up a defensive stance atop a hill. Until the arrival of a 215-man American relief force, General Pico maintained the siege of the mountain. Under Kearny, an American force of 600 men started a 150-mile march toward Los Angeles. In the 2-hour Battle of Rio San Gabriel on January 8, 1847, the Stockton-Kearny army defeated the Mexican force. With the signing of the Treaty of Cahuenga, fighting in California ended. While armed resistance in California ended, the fighting went on in other places. Further political unrest in Mexico resulted from the Mexican army's losses at Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma. 2,300 American soldiers, under the command of Zachary Taylor, crossed the Rio Grande and moved south. Both sides suffered significant losses in the fiercely contested Battle of Monterrey. General Pedro de Ampudia's Mexican forces drove back Taylor's finest infantry. Well-hidden Mexican defenders caught American soldiers off guard as they marched straight down the open streets, unaccustomed to urban warfare. General Taylor negotiated an 8-week armistice with the Mexican army, allowing them to leave in exchange for the city's surrender, even though the Mexicans had repelled the Americans. Taylor violated the armistice and took Saltillo after pressure from Washington. Santa Anna personally marched north with 20,000 men on February 22, 1847, to engage General Taylor in combat. The 4,600 Americans had taken up residence at Buena Vista, a mountain pass. The Mexicans arrived with 15,000 exhausted men after suffering desertions on the way north. Santa Anna demanded the U.S. Army's surrender, but was denied it because he knew his numbers were still superior. So he launched an attack the following morning. While a division of infantry launched a frontal assault along the road leading to Buena Vista, Santa Anna sent his cavalry and some infantry up the steep terrain on one side of the pass to flank the U.S. positions. Despite being outnumbered, the Mexicans suffered greatly from the American horse artillery and came close to breaching the American lines on multiple occasions. Santa Anna withdrew the following day, after learning of a rebellion and unrest in Mexico City, even though early accounts of the battle and some propaganda news gave the Mexicans the victory. According to some military historians, if the Mexicans had carried out their last attack, the U.S. Army most likely would have lost. Securing its naval presence along Mexico's coasts was a crucial detail for the United States to win the war against Mexico. The U.S. Navy made it possible for American troops and supplies to enter Mexico, particularly Veracruz, the country's main port. The U.S. Navy had established a blockade in the disputed northern region even before fighting broke out. Taylor's army did not receive reinforcements from the U.S. president to continue their advance. Rather, he dispatched General Winfield Scott's Second Army. To launch an invasion of the Mexican heartland, Scott was taken by sea to the port of Veracruz. In anticipation of the siege of Veracruz, Scott made the first significant amphibious landing in American history on March 9, 1847. The city used its artillery to respond as best it could to the prolonged barrage, but the Mexicans were forced to surrender because of the Americans' numerical superiority. The capital was the aim. Scott led nearly 9,000 soldiers in a march west toward Mexico City. About 50 miles northwest of Veracruz at Cerro Gordo, Santa Anna established a defensive position around the main road on April 2, 1847. Santa Anna had positioned 12,000 soldiers and artillery on the road, where he thought Scott would show up and surprise him. But General Scott had advanced with 2,600 cavalry troops. On April 12th, the Mexican artillery opened fire on them as they arrived at the pass, exposing their positions. The Americans won the Battle of Cerro Gordo and proceeded with their advance. Although American troops were harassed by guerrillas, General Winfield Scott continued to advance on Mexico City. A series of battles around the right flank of the city defenses laid upon the capital. Following the American triumphs in the Battle of Churubusco and the Battle of Contreras, peace talks began, but failed on September 6, 1847. The capital was occupied as a result of the subsequent battles of Chapultepec and Molino del Rey, as well as the storming of the city gates. Scott was appointed Mexico City's military governor. He became an American national hero as a result of his campaign victories. The Mexican army suffered greatly from desertions, which reduced their numbers just before combat. The majority of the troops were peasants who were loyal to their families and villages, but not to the generals who had drafted them. The soldiers, who were frequently malnourished, sick, ill-prepared, only partially trained, and never paid, had little motivation to fight the Americans and were despised by their officers. The question of whether to annex Mexico itself was now raised, as the United States had now far exceeded the territorial gains it had hoped to achieve by invading central Mexico with its dense population. Due to cultural differences, overstretching, and the extreme instability this would bring about, many people were against the idea. Texas, Alta California, and Nuevo Mexico were granted to the United States, by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Over time, these territories were consolidated into other states. In exchange, Mexico got $15 million, or about $443 million today, which was less than half of what the United States had previously tried to give Mexico. The low cost for the United States was probably due to the sparse population in those areas. The United States gained more than 900,000 square miles of land with the secession of Mexico and Texas. The present border between the United States and Mexico was established by the Gadsden Purchase, another American acquisition,